He built his Boston empire on blood, absolute loyalty, and a vow to slaughter the rat who murdered his brother. But what happens when the ruthless Don falls desperately in love with the sweet, innocent nurse who saved his life only to find her fingerprints on his darkest betrayal? St. Jude's Memorial Hospital was a crumbling brick monolith on the south side of Boston, and for the last 3 years, it had been Nora Hayes's entire world. At 26, Nora was drowning. Between double shifts in the trauma ward and dodging the relentless phone calls from the debt collectors hunting down her father, Silas, her life was a suffocating loop of exhaustion and fear. Silas owed $45,000 to a local Irish loan shark named Declan O'Malley, and time had run out. It was 2:14 a.m. on a freezing Tuesday in November when the hospital's unspoken protocol was enacted. Doctor Samuel Aris, the chief of surgery, grabbed Nora by the elbow just as she was clocking out. His face was devoid of color. Basement trauma room. Now, no charts, no names. Nora, just do your job. Doctor, Aris ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. Nora knew the drill. St. Jude's had an underground agreement with the Rossi family, the apex predators of the Boston syndicate, in exchange for massive, anonymous donations that kept the hospital from going bankrupt. The staff occasionally patched up gunshot wounds with zero police involvement. She pushed through the heavy steel doors of the basement clinic, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing like angry hornets overhead. The room smelled sharply of copper and antiseptic. On the metal table lay a man in a ruined, blood-soaked Brioni suit. He was surrounded by 3 massive men in dark coats, their hands hovering near the bulges under their jackets. "Out, Doctor," Aris commanded the guards. "If you want him to breathe, get out of my way." The men hesitated until the man on the table, Dominic Rossi, lifted a blood-stained hand. "Wait outside. Leo," he rasped. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the small room. Dominic was 32, striking in a savage, untamed way, with sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw shadow, and piercing, predatory dark eyes, even bleeding out from a gunshot wound to the right shoulder. He radiated absolute control. Nora immediately went to work. She didn't look at his face. She looked at the wound. It was a 9mm round, lodged deep, dangerously close to the subclavian artery. As she cut away his ruined shirt, her bare fingers brushed against the warm skin of his chest. His hand shot out with terrifying speed, his fingers wrapping around her wrist like a steel vice. Nora gasped, dropping the trauma shears. Dominic's feverish eyes locked onto hers. The pain in his gaze was entirely masked by raw, animalistic threat. "You make a mistake, oh sweetheart, and Leo comes back in here to paint the walls with you." "Let go of me," Nora said, her voice shaking but her chin held high. "Or you bleed to death on this table. It's your choice." A flicker of surprise crossed Dominic's face. The grip loosened, his thumb briefly dragging across her racing pulse point before his hand fell back to his side. "Do it," he gritted out. For the next 2 hours, Nora and Doctor. Aris worked frantically. Nora's hands were steady, her training taking over as she applied hemostatic agents, clamped bleeders, and assisted in extracting the bullet. Throughout the agonizing procedure, performed with only local anesthesia to keep his heart rate manageable. Dominic never looked away from Nora. He watched the furrow of her brow, the sweat beading on her forehead, the gentle, precise way her hands moved over his skin. In his brutal, violent world, He had never seen someone so entirely focused on preserving life. When it was over, "Doctor." Aris stepped out to speak to Leo. Nora was left alone with the Don to clean the wound site and apply the bandages. "What's your name?" Dominic asked, his voice rough from the pain. "I'm not supposed to give you my name," Nora replied quietly, wiping away the iodine. "I'm Dominic. I know who you are. Mr. Rossi. Everyone in this city knows who you are." Dominic reached into the pocket of his discarded, ruined suit jacket and pulled out a thick, blood-smeared envelope. He tossed it onto the metal tray beside her. "Take it." Nora glanced at the envelope. It was thick with $100 bills, easily $10,000. Her mind flashed to Declan O'Malley, to the bruised ribs her father had come home with 2 days ago. She needed that money desperately. It was the difference between life and death for her family. "I can't," Nora lied, her pride warring with her desperation. "I don't owe debts," Dominic said softly, his dark eyes stripping away her defenses. "You saved my life tonight. Take the money, nurse, or I'll find out your name and leave it on your doorstep anyway." Trembling, Nora slipped the envelope into her scrub pockets. She thought that was the end of it. She thought she would walk out of the basement and never see the Mafia boss again. She was wrong. 3 days later, Nora was violently shoved against the brick wall of an alley behind her apartment building. It was pouring rain. Declan O'Malley's enforcer, a hulking man named Briggs, had his forearm pressed against her throat, choking off her air. "Your old man is out of time, Nora," Briggs spat, the smell of cheap whiskey on his breath. "The 10 grand you dropped off was a nice down payment, but Declan wants the remaining 35,000 by midnight, or we start taking pieces of Silas, and then we come for you." He dropped her into the muddy puddles. Nora gasped for air, coughing, tears of absolute panic streaming down her face. She had nothing left to pawn, no one left to borrow from. Suddenly, the roar of a V8 engine cut through the rain. A sleek, black Lincoln Navigator mounted the curb, its high beams blinding the alleyway. The doors opened in unison. 3 men stepped out. At the center was Dominic Rossi. His right arm was in a sling, hidden beneath a tailored cashmere overcoat, but the aura of power surrounding him was suffocating. Leo Bianchi, his lethal right-hand man, stood beside him, a suppressed pistol already drawn and resting casually against his thigh. Briggs froze, all the color draining from his face. "Mr. Rossi," he stammered, stepping away from Nora. This is Irish territory. It's just a debt collection." "She's mine," Dominic said. The words were quiet, but they echoed like a gunshot in the narrow alley. "If you or Declan O'Malley ever look at her again, I will burn your pubs to the ground with you locked inside. The debt is cleared. Now run." Briggs didn't hesitate. He scrambled past them and disappeared into the rain. Dominic walked toward Nora, uncaring of the mud ruining his Italian leather shoes. He knelt before her, pulling a silk handkerchief from his pocket, and gently wiped the grime from her cheek. The contrast between the ruthless monster who had just threatened a man's life and the gentle touch on her skin sent a shiver down her spine. "I told you I don't leave debts unpaid, Nora Hayes," Dominic said, proving he had already dug into her life. "Get in the car." "Where are you taking me?" she whispered, terrified, but strangely mesmerized. "You're moving into my estate on Lakeshore Drive," he stated, leaving no room for argument. "My personal physician is out of the country, and I need a live-in nurse to oversee my recovery. I pay well, and as you just saw, I offer unparalleled security." Nora had no choice. She was trapped. The Rossi estate was a fortress disguised as a palace. For the next 3 weeks, Nora lived in a world of unimaginable luxury and suffocating tension. Her bedroom was larger than her entire apartment, overlooking the icy expanse of Lake Michigan. She tended to Dominic's wound twice a day, ensuring no infection set in. But as the days turned into weeks, the professional boundaries began to blur. Dominic was not the one-dimensional monster the news portrayed. Late at night, in the sprawling library, they would share glasses of expensive bourbon. Nora discovered his sharp intellect, his dry sense of humor, and the crushing weight of the empire he carried. He listened to her talk about nursing, about her dream of opening a free clinic, treating her with a respect she had never experienced. Dominic was falling for her. Nora could see it in the way his gaze lingered on her lips, the way he found excuses to brush her hair behind her ear, the way the ruthless Don softened entirely when she entered a room. And God help her, she was falling for him too. The fear was morphing into a deep, consuming obsession. One evening, a thunderstorm rolled over Boston. Nora found Dominic standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the lightning. The scars on his back were visible through his thin shirt. "You're quiet tonight," Nora said, stepping up beside him. Dominic didn't look at her. 5 years ago tonight, my younger brother, Matteo, was killed. Nora's heart stopped. The blood froze in her veins. She felt the sudden urge to vomit, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany desk behind her to stay upright. It was an ambush at Navy Pier. Dominic continued, his voice hollow, dripping with an old, festering rage. "We were moving a shipment. Only 3 people knew the exact time and container number. Someone on the inside, or someone who got to my people, leaked the intel to the Moretti family. They gunned Matteo down in the rain. He bled to death on the concrete. I've hunted the rat ever since. I wiped out half the Moretti syndicate, trying to find out who made the phone call to tip them off." He finally turned to Nora, his dark eyes softening as he looked at her pale face. He reached out, cupping her cheek. "You're shivering. I'm sorry. I shouldn't burden you with the violence of my world. You're too pure for this. Nora, you're the only good thing that's happened to me in 5 years. He leaned in and kissed her. It was a kiss full of desperate hunger, of a man seeking salvation. Nora kissed him back, tears sliding down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of passion. They were tears of pure, unadulterated terror. Because Nora knew exactly how Matteo Rossi had died, 5 years ago, Nora had been a terrified nursing student. Her father, Silas, had gotten into debt with the Morettis. To pay it off, the Morettis had kidnapped Silas and forced a young Nora to do the unthinkable, steal a burner phone from a dying mobster she was treating in the ER, read the text message containing the Navy Pier coordinates, and hand that information over. She was the one who made the phone call. She was the informant who had accidentally set up Matteo Rossi's execution. Nora pulled away from the kiss, feigning exhaustion, and fled to her room. She locked the door, sliding down the wood to the floor, sobbing silently into her hands. The man she was falling in love with, the man who had just saved her life, was the man she had destroyed 5 years ago. If he found out, he wouldn't just kill her, he would torture her. Meanwhile, downstairs in the shadowed study, Leo Bianchi entered, locking the heavy doors behind him. He didn't look happy. Dom, Leo said, his voice grim. I told you I was going to run a deep background check on the nurse. You didn't want me to, but I did it anyway. It's my job to protect you. Dominic poured a drink, irritation flashing in his eyes. I told you to leave Nora alone. Leo, she's clean. She's just a nurse trying to pay off her degenerate father's debts. She is now, Leo said, stepping into the light and tossing a thick manila folder onto the desk. But I dug into Silas Hayes's old gambling records. Before he was into the Irish, he was deep in the hole with the Moretti family. 5 years ago, his massive debt was miraculously wiped clean. The exact same week Matteo was murdered. Dominic froze, the glass of bourbon halfway to his lips. And there's more, Leo said softly, sliding a grainy, black and white surveillance photo across the desk. It was taken from a security camera outside a Moretti-owned diner 5 years ago. Dominic stared at the photograph. The air in the room seemed to evaporate. There, standing in the rain, handing a burner phone to a Moretti underboss, was a much younger, terrified-looking Nora Hayes. The glass in Dominic's hand shattered, bourbon and blood dripping onto the mahogany wood. The morning sun over Lake Michigan was blinding, casting long, sharp shadows across the penthouse suite. Nora woke to the smell of freshly brewed espresso, but the bed beside her was empty and cold. When she walked into the dining room, Dominic was sitting at the head of the long mahogany table. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his tie knotted with absolute precision. The sling was gone. He looked completely healed, but his eyes, those dark, piercing eyes that had looked at her with such raw hunger the night before, were completely dead. They were the eyes of the ruthless Don the city feared. "Get dressed," Dominic said, his voice flat, devoid of any inflection. "We're going for a drive." "Dominic, is everything all right?" Nora asked, her pulse immediately spiking. "I said get dressed." "Nora." The silence in the black Navigator was suffocating. Leo drove, his eyes flickering to the rearview mirror with a cold, almost triumphant glint. Dominic stared out the window, a statue carved from ice. Nora's stomach twisted into violent knots. She recognized the route. They were heading south, towards the water, towards Navy Pier. When the SUV pulled into an abandoned, rusted shipping yard adjacent to the pier, the bottom dropped out of Nora's world. The rain from last night had left deep, oily puddles on the cracked concrete. Dominic stepped out and opened her door. He grabbed her arm, not with the gentle touch of a lover, but with the punishing grip of a captor, and dragged her toward the center of the yard. "Do you know where we are?" Dominic asked, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel of the empty warehouses. "Dominic, please, you're hurting me," Nora cried, stumbling over her own feet. He spun her around, shoving her roughly against the cold metal of a shipping container. He reached into his coat and pulled out the grainy, black and white photograph. He slammed it against the steel, right next to her face. "Look at it!" he roared, the sudden explosion of his rage vibrating through the air. "Look at it! Nora, 5 years ago. A Moretti diner. You handed them the coordinates that put a bullet through my little brother's heart." Nora squeezed her eyes shut, sobbing hysterically. "I didn't know. Oh God, Dominic, I didn't know what it was." He drew his gun. The metallic rack of the slide sounded deafening in the quiet yard. He pressed the cold steel barrel directly under her chin, forcing her to look at him. His hand was shaking. The ruthless monster of Boston was trembling. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't paint this container with your brains," Dominic whispered, a single tear cutting through the angry mask of his face. You let me kiss you. You let me bring you into my home. You slept under my roof, knowing you slaughtered my blood. They had my father. Nora screamed, her voice cracking, tears pouring down her cheeks. The Morettis. They dragged Silas to a basement. They sent me a video of them cutting off his fingers. They told me if I didn't take that burner phone from the ER and deliver it to them, they would send him back to me in pieces. I was a nursing student. Dominic, I was 21. I didn't know who Matteo was. I didn't know what the numbers meant. I just wanted to save my dad. Dominic stared at her, the gun still pressed to her throat. He saw the raw, unadulterated truth in her eyes. He saw the terrified, shattered girl she had been. But the ghost of his brother screamed in his ear. He lowered the gun, a guttural sound of pure agony ripping from his chest. He turned his back to her, running a hand through his hair. Leo stepped forward, his hand resting on his own weapon. She's a rat. Dom. She pulled the trigger just as surely as the men who fired the guns. The syndicate rules are absolute. Blood for blood. Give the order. Dominic turned, his eyes hollow. He looked at Nora, shivering and sobbing against the rusted metal. Take her back to the estate, he said to Leo, his voice completely dead. Lock her in the cellar holding room. If she tries to run, shoot her. Dom, you can't be serious, Leo started. Do it, Dominic bellowed, asserting his absolute authority. For 3 days, Nora sat in the subterranean dark of the Rossi estate. The wine cellar had been retrofitted with a reinforced steel door and a heavy deadbolt. She had a cot, a bucket, and her own crushing guilt. She knew she was going to die. Dominic's pride and the laws of his world wouldn't allow her to live. But as the hours bled together, the panic subsided, replaced by a desperate, clarifying focus. She replayed that night 5 years ago over and over in her mind. She remembered the rain. She remembered the terrified ER patient, bleeding out from a knife wound, who had handed her the burner phone, whispering that it was life or death. But most importantly, she remembered the man waiting for her outside the diner. He wasn't a standard Moretti thug. He had worn a heavy, dark coat. And when he reached out to take the phone from her trembling hands, the streetlight had caught a very specific piece of jewelry. A heavy, custom-made gold pinky ring set with a massive, blood-red ruby engraved with a 2-headed eagle. Nora gasped in the darkness of her cell, the Rossi family crest. The man who took the phone from her hadn't been a Moretti. It was someone on the inside. Someone who wanted Matteo dead, but needed the Morettis to do the dirty work, using a desperate nursing student as the perfect, untraceable courier. And 3 days ago, when Leo Bianchi had gripped the steering wheel of the SUV, Nora had seen that exact same blood-red ruby ring gleaming on his left hand. The heavy metallic clunk of the deadbolt, sliding open, echoed through the damp cellar. The heavy steel door swung wide, bleeding pale yellow light into the darkness. Leo Bianchi stood in the doorway. He wasn't holding a tray of food. He was holding a suppressed 9mm pistol and a heavy, braided nylon rope. "Time's up, sweetheart," Leo said, stepping into the cell and closing the door behind him. Dom can't bring himself to do it. The boss has gone soft over a pretty face. So, he sent me down here to clean up his mess. We're going to make it look like the guilt finally ate you alive. A tragic hanging. Nora backed against the stone wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Dominic didn't send you," she stated, her voice surprisingly steady despite the terror freezing her blood. "If Dominic wanted me dead, he would have done it at the pier. He wouldn't hide behind you." Leo chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Maybe, but once you're swinging from the rafters, he'll accept it. It solves everyone's problems." "You killed Matteo," Nora said. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Leo stopped, his eyes narrowing, the gun leveled directly at her chest. "Careful, nurse. Don't go making up ghost stories before you die. I remember the ring." "Leo," Nora said, her eyes locked on his left hand. "5 years ago, you were the one outside the diner. You took the phone from me. You fed the intel to the Morettis so they would ambush Matteo. Why was Matteo going to take your spot? Was he going to tell Dominic you were stealing from the family?" Leo's smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, reptilian glare. "Matteo was a loud-mouthed, self-righteous brat. He found out I was skimming from the union accounts. He was going to go to Dom the next morning. I had to silence him, but I couldn't pull the trigger myself. So, I leaked the route to the Morettis. I knew your degenerate father owed them money. You were the perfect, invisible pawn." Leo took a step closer, raising the gun to her head. "It's a shame you remembered, but it doesn't matter. No one is going to believe the rat over the boss's right hand." "I believe her." The voice came from the shadows outside the heavy steel door. Leo froze, the color violently draining from his face. He spun around just as the door was kicked entirely open. Dominic Rossi stood in the light. He looked like the Grim Reaper in a tailored suit. His eyes were completely black, devoid of anything human. In his hand was a heavy, silver-plated .45 caliber revolver. "Dom," Leo stammered, lowering his weapon slightly. "Dom, listen to me. She's lying. She's trying to save her own skin. You always were arrogant." "Leo," Dominic said, stepping slowly into the cell. "Did you really think I'd blindly believe a 5-year-old file you miraculously found the moment I started caring for this woman? I had my men toss your apartment 3 hours ago. We found the offshore bank accounts. We found the union money." Dominic's voice dropped to a terrifying, absolute whisper. "You sold my brother's blood for cash." Leo realized he was trapped. The loyalty of the Mafia vanished in an instant, replaced by the desperate instinct of a cornered rat. He raised his 9mm toward Dominic, but Dominic was faster. He had been born in violence, molded by it. The roar of the .45 in the enclosed cellar was deafening. The bullet caught Leo square in the chest, the kinetic force lifting him off his feet and slamming him into the stone wall. He slid to the floor, gasping, blood bubbling past his lips. Dominic walked over to the dying man. He didn't say a word. He raised the revolver, aimed at Leo's head, and pulled the trigger a second time. The ringing in the cell was absolute. The smell of cordite and copper filled the damp air. Dominic lowered the gun. He stood there for a long time, staring at the man who had been his closest friend, the man who had murdered his brother. Then, the heavy revolver slipped from his fingers, clattering against the stone floor. He turned to Nora. She was sliding down the wall, trembling uncontrollably, her hands covering her ears. Dominic crossed the room and dropped to his knees in front of her. He reached out with shaking, blood-spattered hands and pulled her into his chest. He buried his face in her neck, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I'm sorry," Dominic choked out, the ruthless Mafia boss entirely breaking down in the damp dark of the cellar. "I'm so damn sorry. Nora, I left you in the dark. I almost let him hurt you." Nora wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, burying her tears in his suit. "You came," she sobbed. "You believed me. You gave me the truth," Dominic whispered, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes, cupping her face with overwhelming tenderness. "You gave me the man who killed my brother. The debt is paid. Nora, it's all paid. The empire of blood outside their walls would still demand its toll. There would be bodies to bury, rivals to crush, and a syndicate to rebuild. But as Dominic carried the poor nurse out of the darkness and up into the light of his fortress, they both knew the past was finally dead. From the ashes of betrayal, the Don had found his queen. If this dark, twisted tale of loyalty, betrayal, and Mafia romance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Have you ever forgiven someone who kept a massive secret to protect their family? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Don't forget to share this story with your fellow drama lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired storytelling.